The motion before the House was, this House would be immortal. I think it's just a sign of kind of how sad we are here in the GMB. That even though everyone else is, taking a break from college, going on holidays to Amsterdam and Prague, we still showed up to debate. Although, to be fair, rather than sort of taking place in this fancy chamber with us all dressed up in black tie, it was a rather more relaxed affair up in our conversation room. And it was basically just an excuse for us to drink while using the Society's fund, which you can only sort of do if you actually have a debate. As a result of all the drinking, however, no one was really paying attention to the debate that happened, and no one really recorded any minutes, so I'm not sure what to say. This is just all sort of going from memory. And one speech in particular did stand out, though, and that was Alex Pugh's. The motion just seemed a bit too real for him. What with him constantly. And when you couple this with his aversion to light and his fear of mirrors, this just leads us to ask, where exactly in Transylvania are you from? There being no further business, the meeting adjourned.
So, are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting?
Hi guys, for the third time, welcome. Particularly welcome to our guests, particularly more welcome to our guests tonight. Mr. Michael Nugent, a writer and chairperson of Atheist Ireland, Dr. Fáinse Ryan, assistant professor in theology, Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. Ian Leese, doctor in philosophy at the Mater Dei Institute, as well as again our chair. Also welcome to all the people for coming in tonight. It's always lovely to see this big crowd on such a awful night. I'd also like to draw your attention to these, which are on your seats. These are standing orders. They allow you to rate our speakers. Please stick to the rating system given. We occasionally get other comments on them, which isn't super helpful. Also, just for all of your information, speeches from our student speakers are 7 minutes, guests are 10 minutes. The first minute is protected time. After the first minute, you'll hear a bell. After that, you can ask a question of the speaker, generally say on that point or a point of information, and stand up just so they can see you. If they don't accept you after about 30 seconds, probably sit down. Please keep your point of information to about 15 to 20 seconds, otherwise someone will order on you. Then after 6 minutes, you'll hear another bell, and that is again a final protected minute of time, at which point you can't ask any more questions. Other than that, please do interact with our debate plenty. It's very enjoyable, and have a great night. And I hand it back over to our chair.
The question before the House this evening is that this House believes that the existence of evil disproves God. And I should now like to call upon Colin Finlay to propose the motion to the House.
Mr. Chair, members of the proposition, opposition, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society and Dublin University Metaphysical Society, God, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to be speaking to the HIST again. The last time I spoke to the HIST was 2 years ago when I organised a debate on the Catholic Church can be salvaged. The opposition was the unlikely pairing of Michael Nugent, who I'm mimicking tonight from my red, and Sinead O'Connor. Sinead, for some reason, came dressed as a soldier, and yeah, it's true. Sinead came dressed as a soldier for some reason, and the Archbishop, who's supposed to be chair, got replaced by Max Krasnowski from LGBT Noise. So that was an interesting change. And I remember thinking later that day, the Archbishop failed to show. Before the House this evening, in support of the motion that the existence of evil disproves the existence of God. In this speech, I'm going to address some arguments put forward by both Aquinas who argued against that idea, but first it would be necessary to deconstruct the proposition and define the terms of the debate. Firstly, we will take existence as a state of being instantiated objectively outside of one's own perception. Secondly, evil, human or natural, are acts, behaviour or events which are extremely detrimental to the well-being of sentient beings and which are both unnecessary and undesirable. Thirdly, instead of proof or disproof, which aren't terms used in epistemology, we will be talking about justification. Justification is what makes a claim a good one or a bad one, and justification exists along a spectrum. A good justification is one that successfully applies deductive reasoning and explains any related empirical phenomena. And finally, God will be taken to mean a being which has 4 properties: omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence, although these can be boiled down to just 2 fundamental principles, which are omnipotence and omnibenevolence. This is the conception of God discussed historically by both proponents and opponents of theodicy, the conception which the problem of evil was designed to counter, and obviously the one we should be discussing this evening. Claims that posit the existence of God are claims that there exists some metaphysical object with certain properties. As an object, God is a hypothesis in a theory attempting to explain the universe. Unless this theory is internally coherent, based on true premises, and adequately explains all the observations we make, it is not a well-justified theory. This debate is not about the nature of absolute knowledge or of absolute proof, and it is also not about the existence of a different kind of deity, be it a deistic one or even an evil or deceiving one. It is just about justifications for a theistic God. So, the burden of the proposition is simply to highlight how our observation of events and behaviour that cause undue suffering to sentient life in the world means that arguments put forward for the existence of a theistic entity are not strongly justified ones. The problem of evil is a basic modus ponens argument, which, as you know, is the most fundamental kind of logical argument, and it goes back several millennia. In the 3rd century BCE, Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, famously stated, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?" This famous trilemma raises serious questions about any claim that there exists a God with those characteristics. Of course, in the last 2,500 years, various philosophers and theologians have attempted to reanalyze this from various approaches and various angles. Perhaps most famously, it was St. Thomas Aquinas who argued that there was no such thing as evil in the sense that we'd understand it. Aquinas argued that evil was neither an absolute nor the opposite of good, but as Aquinas had argued before him, the privation of good. He argued that what we call evil is simply a process of destruction which is necessary for good, and indeed, if supposed acts of evil really are necessary, then we cannot call them evil at all. His reasoning was that destruction was necessary in order for greater substantiations of good to be achieved, and to achieve greater levels of form, lesser levels of form must first be destroyed. So we are led to believe, for instance, if an old man's barn is burned down on his farm in the middle of the night, that is not evil. It is necessary for greater form to be facilitated, perhaps for some kind of larger building to be put up in its stead. The argument is absurd from first principles. It is unclear how destruction always leads to something greater, or even often, and many examples of evil that we witness in the world have no positive effect on the world whatsoever. And we can see random acts of violence in the streets of Dublin, and we can see terrible acts of evil in places like Paris and Beirut in recent days. Moreover, modern physics shows that the basic presumptions behind Aquinas' reasoning were simply false. The universe does not become more ordered over time. The universe is becoming increasingly less ordered, and that is shown by the various laws of thermodynamics, which show that the universe will ultimately probably collapse in entropic heat traps. So as Terry Pratchett once said, the reason why chaos always wins over order is because chaos is much better organized. The strongest argument is actually put forward by Leibniz, who personally first used the term theodicy. In a similar vein to Aquinas, Leibniz argued that evil does not really exist in the world. Leibniz sought to show that we live in the best of all possible worlds. So, Aquinas argued, for instance, that if you take Luke, there's actually an infinite number of potential Lukes that exist in the universe. And God, being all-knowing, knows which way each individual Luke will react in a given situation, and they will all react freely. And God, being all-good and all-powerful, actualizes the version of Luke which will best contribute to living in the best possible world. So presumably in this instance, the Luke will give the most money to Ollie so we can have the best possible reception after this debate. The problem with this use of logic, however, is that Leibniz presumes the existence of God and attempts to demonstrate how that disproves the existence of evil. However, it is evil that we observe firsthand in the external world, not God, so his argument is really just a misapplication of the modus tollens. In conclusion, what adequately explains the existence of evil is a sufficient understanding of cause and effect in a universe governed by no God, or at least by a God who is not simultaneously all-powerful and all-good. Theodicy attempts to find an explanation where no explanation is necessary. It is better to simply dispose of the needless assumption of God in the first place than attempt to juxtapose it with a phenomenon that we know to exist and we know to be incompatible with it. For the reasons I've outlined, that evil is observed in the world, that the traditional conception of God is incongruous with this observation, and that attempts to explain evil as either necessary or being disproven by God's existence are unsound and unsuccessful. We can see the justifications for God are not strong ones. I commend the motion to the House. Thank you.
Okay, I'd now like to call upon Peter McManus to oppose the motion to the House.
Ladies and gentlemen, so I'd like to start by saying that I am a chemist, not a philosopher, so I will not be using quite as many of the knowledgeable terms that Colm used there, so I'm going to be taking a much more basic approach to this. And starting off, on the opposition, we disagree with the definition of God. So that is the definition of God that is sort of stated in the traditional problem of evil, but we think that things have moved on since then, and that's simply not a representative view of how everyone in the world sees God today. So I would like to define God as the creator, whoever or whatever it is that started the universe and by extension put humans here. Why he did this, we don't know. Perhaps he has some kind of end goal. I'm not quite sure about that. Maybe it's some kind of, we are the human experiment. He's got some reason for putting us here. And so we've got absolutely no reason to believe that this God has our best interests at heart whatsoever. The interest of the planet or anything to do with us. For all we know, this entire setup was just for his own amusement. No reason to believe that God is in any way benevolent. So we know that all of these terrible things happen that I'm sure the proposition will outline for us. But this doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It simply means that he really doesn't like us or is a terrible, terrible person. So while the existence of evil certainly cast doubt on the sort of the idea of like a Christian, loving, forgiving God, it certainly doesn't disprove in any way the idea of a creator of the universe existing. And in fact, if anything, God has shown himself to be somewhat in favor of what we would describe as evil. So starting with our most well-known God, the Christian God, certainly in his earlier days in the Old Testament, he was not in any way the benevolent God that we're kind of talking about. Like Lot's wife, he turned her to salt for looking back at Sodom and Gomorrah. He wiped out everybody in a giant flood. All the genocide, so much genocide, just like lots and lots and lots of it. Killing all the Egyptian firstborns, and then kind of to top it all off, he created this fiery burning pit where he's going to put all the people who did things he didn't agree with in their 70 years out of infinity and just keep them there. So that doesn't sound like a loving God. It sounds very much like someone who's quite in favor of evil themselves. So I don't think that there's we can make any kind of claim that God is benevolent or really wants us to be good at all. Yep.
Most Holy Scriptures do go on to claim, for example, like the later Testament and the Torah, the Quran, basically anything, that God is omnibenevolent and that he loves us all. So I don't think it's quite fair to say that.
He's got a very strange way of showing it, I would say. But so maybe I'm being too harsh on God. Maybe just a little bit. So maybe it is that God had no choice in creating the world that we currently have. Maybe the way that the world is the only way that it can possibly be. As Einstein famously pondered, could God have made the world in a different way? Or does the necessity of logical simplicity leave any freedom at all? So what he was saying there was whether this universe that we have, with all of its failings and its particular laws of nature, is it the only one that possibly works? Is it the only way God could have made the universe? So for example, if the nuclear strong force was just 10% weaker than what it is, then we wouldn't be able to hold atoms together. None of this would be here. Could the universe exist with another gravitational constant? Or all of the laws of the universe exactly the way that they have to be in order to get us to the point where we are now? So what I'm saying is that a lot of the evils in our world, they're caused by the very things that make life possible. So for example, evolution. So if we assume by my previous definition of God that he's kind of the guy who pressed the go button on evolution, pushed the first domino that set it all off, then evolution is the reason that we exist. It's the reason that we have such a beautiful and diverse world that we have, that we are, yes?
So given that evolution and genetic variation are processes that are incredibly fault-prone, produce a wide variety of completely non-functioning and in many cases dead offspring and the like, why would a God that can create a perfect system create something so flawed?
Oh, see, this is my point, that perhaps God, perhaps there, because of the conditions, the starting conditions that we have in the universe, these fundamental constants that are essential to this one universe that works, maybe they were set in stone at the beginning. And yes, evolution is extremely flawed. So this very thing that allows us to exist is also responsible for, through genetic mutations, for an awful lot of the suffering that we have in the world. So it's responsible for cancer, for an awful lot of congenital diseases and immune failings. And a lot of these things cause a huge amount of suffering. But without them, we would not have humanity. Similarly, with natural disasters, so say earthquakes, for example. Earthquakes and volcanoes occur in areas where you've got like tectonic plates crossing and high levels of geological activity. And you know, they kill hundreds of people every year. They're horrific events. But also that like uprooting of the universe, or of the world, like throws up nutrients and allows us to grow crops. Like that's what allows the earth to be fertile and to produce life and all those kinds of things. So again, it's more like a byproduct of the universe that we have. And so that's why you often get like a lot of civilizations that grow up around fault lines. And then of course that explains like natural evil, but we also have evil in humans. Like, why would God create humans that can commit evil acts? And so it must surely be the case that it was necessary for humans to reach the point where we are, that God had to in the first place give us free will. For whatever reason, perhaps in order to evolve to the point that we are, humans had to have the free will to make their own choices. And the consequence, the byproduct of that, is that people will use that free will to hurt others. And so, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I see absolutely no reason why the fact that natural and moral evil exists in this world means that a creator God does not also exist. I would say that at his worst, God is evil himself, and that at best, incompetent and uninterested in human affairs. I beg you to oppose.
I now call on the second speaker to propose the motion, Kira Walsh.
Okay, so the way that we prove so I'm going to start off with a bit of rebuttal. The way that we prove the creator God version doesn't exist is by studying science and specifically evolution. But my speech is going to focus on the original and most used definition of God that's been floating around for generations. It is how he is defined, and it's what I'm going to use in this debate tonight. I want to throw now that I'm an atheist, so as far as I'm concerned, regardless, God's made up. But what I'm going to do is work within this debate and work within the parameters that theists have set up to define God. I'll work to prove their concept of I'll work to prove their concept of God doesn't exist, because evil exists in our world. So there's a pretty standard definition which has already been given to us in our opening speech, which is that God is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally good being. So if God exists, then he, she, or it would have all those properties. So if this being with all these properties exists, then there would be no evil. Why? Because if God was all-knowing, it would know when evil is going to occur. If it was all-powerful, it would have the abilities to stop it from occurring. And wholly good, it would have the motivation as well. We assume for the purpose of this argument that God exists, and then we must therefore conclude that there's no evil. The problem is that there is evil, so there's a clear contradiction and something must be rejected. It's impossible to reject the fact that God is designed by the above characteristics, as much as Kosh just tried to there, but because it's how we've come to define God. But the fact that evil exists in this world is also hard to deny. So why does evil exist? Theists are left in a position that either they have to claim that there's no evil in the world, or they have to give up at least one of their features of God, and neither look very appealing. So now we're in a position to say, if you don't want to do that, no thanks, you're an irrational theist. Because there's compelling evidence that God, defined by these properties that we know to be defined by, does not exist, and yet you believe it anyway. That's to say, you believe a contradiction. You believe that there is evil, but there's no evil. You believe this kind of God does exist, but this kind of God cannot exist. So what are the theist's defense to such a problem? The first is that God could not have created a world without evil. They say somehow good requires evil, therefore without evil in the world, there would also be no good. Okay.
Kira, so the contention here is that God is all good. Here's the thing, ignore every religious text ever. You've played The Sims, I've played The Sims. Sometimes it's just fun to be an asshole god and electrocute people.
Okay, but I'm saying evil exists within people, and that's why God doesn't exist. And we're gonna get to this, right? Okay. So the argument that like the world needs evil, it falls for a number of reasons. Like good and evil can be distinct properties of objects and actions. Removing all of the evil from the world does not also remove all the good. Like you don't need a comparison to work out whether like good is good. Like if you get rid of like all the murders in the world, like you're not gonna like not recognize the good things that like Boy Scouts do when they help like old ladies cross the road. Heaven is supposed to be like an example of a place with no evil. Therefore, it is possible for God to create a world with no evil. And like one might argue that like evil and good must be in balance in the universe. So like hell would balance heaven, like good on earth would balance like evil on earth. But like what it doesn't explain is why evil is like unevenly distributed in the world, and like that in itself I think is like a whole other evil. The second argument theists make for why there may be evil in the world is that the world with evil is somehow better than the world without. Like the reasoning goes that without danger, there's no heroism, without hardship, there's no charity, without suffering, there's no salvation. Again, this argument fails for a number of reasons. Claiming a world with evil is better than a world without is claiming that like this world is better than heaven. If this is the case, then isn't God punishing us by sending us to heaven rather than reincarnating us? I realize that's focusing very much on like Christianity, but there are other points related to everything. If God created us, then God created us with the need for suffering to achieve salvation. Either he was evil to do so, or his powers do not extend to the natures of good and evil, meaning that he is not omnipotent. There are many evils in the world that are without effect whatsoever, and therefore serve no greater good. Such evils would not be explained by this reasoning. The third argument that theists make for why there may be evil in the world is that evil is simply the absence of God, like darkness is the absence of light. However, if evil is the absence of God, then God cannot be omnipresent, which is something that we used to define God earlier. Assuming God can be omnipotent but not omnipresent, then evil can occur wherever God is not around. No thanks. The obvious question then is why doesn't God just go there? Like one can also assume then that like God is not all-knowing, no thanks, because he like mustn't know where the evil is occurring. While God stays in one place, he's being evil to those around him who he chooses to let suffer. The fourth and final argument that theists make for why there may be evil in the world is free will, which was brought up in our opening speech on opposition. If God created us with the ability to choose for ourselves, then any evil we choose is not of God's doing. God is off the hook. That's the whole like argument there. Once again, it fails for a number of reasons. If God is all-knowing, then God should have known what we would do with our free will. Therefore, God must have known the evil choices that we would make. Therefore, God could be held in part responsible for the evil in the world. For example, if I created like a robot that could go out and kill like everyone in the world except for everyone in this room, and then that robot goes and kills everyone in the world except for everyone in this room, like I assume you guys are going to be pretty annoyed at me and pretty pissed off and hold me in part responsible for that. Like if I created it, I'm in part responsible. So you guys are kind of like blaming God. There's no reason God could not have given us the ability to make choices, but always err on the side of good. Consider heaven, where everyone always does the good alternative. Either we lose our free will in heaven, or free will can be had without ever doing evil. If we lose our free will in heaven, then yet again, heaven must be a worse place than earth. Free will is in itself a cop-out. It postulates that our decisions are somehow detached from the causal chains of the universe, that somehow our decisions come from a supernatural origin. However, modern cognitive neuroscience has shown us that decisions are purely the result of neural activity coursing through the circuitry of our brains. Thus, if God created us and God designed our brains, then us choosing to do evil things is a result of God's design. Even if you believe free will does not let God off the hook for being responsible for evil in the world, despite everything that I've just said, it still doesn't explain why God doesn't intervene to prevent the evil we choose to commit. There's evil in the world. If God is all-powerful, it could intervene to prevent it. If it's all-knowing, it knows how to intervene to prevent it. And if it was all good, it would want to intervene to prevent it. The idea that God could not have created a world without evil fails. The idea that the world is better without evil fails. The idea that evil is the lack of God's presence fails. And the idea that free will gets God off the hook fails. I'm happy to propose.
I now call on the second speaker to oppose the motion, make their
Okay, so I have the seriously unenviable task of being like the last speaker before the guests, where they tear me to shreds. Okay, first, I'm not going to come up here and tell you that like kids who have leukemia had it coming, or that earthquakes are God's way of making us better people. This debate is being based around like the traditional view of God, based on these, assumptions of benevolence and omnipotence. And I don't think the proposition get to automatically decide what is meant by a term as nebulous as God, a term with so many different meanings, a term that throughout all of human history has meant 1,000,000,001 different things. They've given us no good reason as to why we must obviously dismiss a deistic God or like polytheistic gods, other than that the original argument was that the Abrahamic God is the original one that the argument was set against. The proposition are begging the question. It's like basically a squirrel. And saying, as Kira said, it's a definition we've come to is A, Eurocentric, and B, not an argument. I don't see why you get to dismiss my God from the debate simply because you don't have a direct answer to it. Okay, I'm not taking you. Fuck off. As you've probably guessed by now, I'm about to get fined for unparliamentary language. Hey! As you probably guessed by now, I'm coming at this from a fairly different perspective to the traditional Abrahamic one. I'm a deist. I believe in a higher power that doesn't talk to us, pay any attention to us, or love it, like my parents. You don't have to jump straight from a force that created the universe immediately implies a man with a beard who watches you masturbate every night. So I'd like to move the debate. I'm not going to take you. I'd like to move the debate to the space in between those. Basically, I'm going to show you that while the props arguments might be valid, that is to say, the conclusion follows from all the premises, it isn't sound because the premises are not necessarily true, because God is not automatically benevolent or omnipotent. Okay, so first of all, I'll talk about a God who doesn't love this and why this overcomes the problem of evil, and then I'll talk about some questions that an atheistic worldview can't answer and necessitate some sort of God to solve. Okay, so as we're aware at this point in the debate, the problem of evil only exists if God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. Okay, so if God is intrinsically perfect, which is something that plenty of polytheistic religions as well as deism would dispute as being inherent to the concept of God. So there absolutely can be a first cause or a first mover, etc., without the creator being perfect. We create things all the time without them being perfect. The ability to create something, even if something immensely complicated, does not make you or it perfect. I'm a massive fuck up, and if I were some sort of God, my creations would almost definitely be tortured by things, but I would be in it again, but I would still be a god. We could be the first go of an infant god attempting to create a universe. We could be, I'm not going to take you, we could be a Trarun. We would obviously call any being with the ability to create a universe or a multiverse, etc., God, even if they were imperfect. The ability to create a multiverse does not imply perfection. Okay? Beyond that, the existence of a supreme power does not immediately imply that the supreme power is good. In any religions, God or the gods are evil sometimes, fickle other times, and yet they exist, are immensely powerful, and rule our lives. Okay, many deists, including myself, to a certain extent, would query the idea that God is sentient in the way that we traditionally think of sentience. Far from God creating us in His image, we've created Him in our image, assuming that He is sentient in the way we are sentient, and He cares about suffering in the way that we care about suffering. Suffering is the only harm that we can comprehend, but just because it's the only harm that we can comprehend does not mean what we think of as suffering is real in a sense beyond our own lives, or that God would care about it. Maybe there's something other than suffering that we don't understand to be bad, but is in fact bad. Jeez. Basically. Okay.
Okay, so when we can describe the name of God or anything that can create a universe or possess some sort of creative properties, does the idea of God not lose kind of all significance? And also, what are the justifications for prime mover hypothesis?
Okay, so I'll be getting to a prime mover hypothesis in a second. First of all, I would say that something that can create a multiverse is something with significance. I'd put it, saying it can only create a multiverse, it loses significance. I don't necessarily take as a thing, but that's an interesting idea. It is very important to note that the word God, first of all, has been used in a million different languages in a million different ways, so we can't translate and we can't understand, and there's no possible, I'm not going to take you, there's no possible way that we're going to, cover all of these. The thing that I want to make sure that you guys all understand is that you can't just take the concept of God being just Abrahamic. That's not something that any of us have the right to do, because when we do that, we only talk about a handful of we only talk about certain people, and we beg the question. So okay, so so basically what I'm saying is ultimately whether or not there is a supreme God, evil is not the thing that proves or disproves it. There might be other things. Evil's not it, okay? And so there's plenty of reasons, in my opinion, why there might be a God. So the one that I normally look to is the cosmological argument, which is, comes in many different forms. Basically, it goes like this. Everything that exists has a cause. The universe, as far as I'm concerned, exists. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Now, I understand. So here is the way we know that things exist is science and evolution. Okay, so I get the whole thing that the universe originally the universe expanded out of a singularity. That then we have the question, where did that singularity come from? If we have the thing of we're part of a multiverse, where did that multiverse come from? We get to an infinite regression, which is not a good thing in philosophy, in my understanding of philosophy. But so basically we just keep going back, where did that come from, where did that come from, where did that come from? There has to be something that it just stops there, and I think we're justified in saying that thing where it started there is God. The idea that something that caused everything else to keep causing, no matter how many steps it was removed for, I think we're justified in calling the original mover, the first cause, the first of anything. I think that's something that we on opposition are allowed to call God. I think that I've proven to you, through the cosmological argument that works. And honestly, I don't care, for you narrowing the definition artificially so you can win. So happy to oppose.
I now call on Michael Nugent to propose the motion.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I mean, I think if we're talking about God, particularly capital G God, which is the name of a particular version of God, as opposed to lowercase gods plural, we're essentially talking about the Abrahamic God. If you want to talk about a God that essentially just is evil, the debate is meaningless. We have to be talking about, if we're having a debate, we have to be talking about a God of whom it is claimed that they are inconsistent with evil for the debate to have any meaning. I do agree with Meg that this isn't the argument that disproves God of itself. I think there are many more arguments that disprove God. I think there are a lot of sound arguments to suggest that the evidence that humans invented the idea of gods is much more likely than that gods actually exist. But today we are focusing on one particular issue, which is the issue of evil. And I want to agree with Kathleen as well in terms of the biblical God, that evil doesn't disprove the biblical God, because the biblical God is essentially pretty evil. He certainly seems quite happy with being evil, both in as Yahweh and in his shape-shifting alter ego of Jesus. As Yahweh, he drowned everybody on earth apart from one family because he was upset with himself. He ordered his followers to stone women to death for not being virgins on their wedding night, to stone a man to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. As Catherine said, he killed Lot's wife for turning around. He killed Onan for not completing sexual intercourse with his dead brother's wife. And he killed 14,000 Israelites for murmuring against Moses, which apparently was quite a significant crime. He threatened that he would bring so much evil that it will make your ears tingle. He said that he will smite you with hemorrhoids and an unhealable sore botch. Sounds painful. He said that he will make you eat the flesh of your own children, and my personal favourite, that he will make you so fearful that you will flee even when nobody is chasing you. He sent bears to murder 42 children because they called a prophet a bald head. He ordered armies to kill women and children apart from virgin women, who of course they could keep for themselves. And when he shapeshifted into being Jesus, he said he had come to enforce all of these evil laws. He said that he didn't come to earth to bring peace, but to bring a sword. He said that he will kill the children of Jezebel for the sins of their mother. And as Jesus, he said that most people will go to the eternal fire of hell, where, as the Reverend Ian Paisley used to like to remind his congregation, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And when one of the Reverend Ian Paisley's congregation told him that she had no teeth, he said that teeth will be provided. So evil does not disprove the biblical God, because the biblical God is pretty much either okay with evil or is the direct cause of a lot of evil. What evil does disprove is the type of God that Colin and Kerr were talking about, which is essentially the type of God that... Yeah, I'll take that, yeah.
Okay, so we take the slightly evil-sounding Christian
Yeah.
God. Would it not be quite plausible that an evil God would lie to his followers to get them to follow him? Therefore, he could be evil and still exist.
He could indeed, yeah. I'm going to come to that in a minute. I think that what is common to both types of gods, that particular God that does all of these various things, and the type of God that Colin and Kira were talking about, which is the omnibenevolent, omnipresent. In fact, all of the omnis, apart from as George Carlin once said, can do everything except hasn't got the hang of money. He always needs money. But the comparison between those two is, in their different times, people thought that they were just. People in older times thought that the authority and power of a God was just. And if you look at the justifications for what we would call evil in the Bible, it's not actually about free will. The people who made up the Old Testament God believed that their God was punishing people justly for their sins rather than he was being evil for the sake of it. But as we have moved on and as humans have evolved our sense of morality and our sense of justice based on our evolving compassion and empathy and reciprocity and cooperation and sense of fairness and justice, we now have a different idea of what is just. And in order to move on this old authoritative biblical sense of justice to an Old Testament sense of justice to a modern sense of justice, what Christians have done is they have come up with this idea of a God that is all-knowing, all-powerful and all-good. And to do that, of course, this what you have to do to believe in that God is ignore half of what he says or does in the Bible. But that is essentially the common thread is based on our evolving sense of justice, that people now feel that this type of God is just in the same way as people in Iron Age tribes would have thought that an authoritative, powerful God was just. And so essentially the argument has moved on that the most powerful argument now for the all-powerful, all-knowing God is free will. That's the strongest argument for the coexistence of evil with that type of God. And essentially the argument I'll give you three problems with that argument. Why I think that the strongest argument for the coexistence of evil with that type of God is flawed. Now, the first one, which is an obvious one, is that an all-powerful God could have limited our free will. You know, he's already, if you assume that he exists, he's already done it in loads of ways. We don't have the free will to decide to jump over a tall building or to live to be 150 years old, and it's quite possible for an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God to limit our free will so that we can't choose to cause unnecessary suffering to other sentient beings. And one response to that is, well, how can we know the mind of God? The mind of God is mysterious. And, maybe for reasons that we don't understand. In fact, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, maybe this is the only way that God could have created a world where we have free will and where there is no suffering. It mightn't be possible to create a world without suffering. But the difficulty with that argument is that most people who believe in this type of God believe that this God has actually created that type of world, because they typically believe in heaven. And so if God can create a heaven where people can exist without causing unnecessary suffering, I'll just finish the point and then if I have time I'll come back to you. If God can create that type of a world in heaven, why can't he create it on earth? Or why didn't he just create us all in heaven? So that's the first argument, that an all-powerful God could have chosen to give us free will but limit that free will to not causing unnecessary suffering. The second obvious argument against it is that free will doesn't account for natural disasters. It doesn't explain earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, etc. Now, if you go back to the biblical God, it does. If you go back to the Old Testament God, he said in Isaiah 45:7, I form the light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now, in some versions of the Bible, that word evil is translated into calamity or disaster. But essentially, whatever word you use, it makes the biblical God responsible for those natural disasters and that unnecessary suffering. But the newly reformed God, who is supposed to be all-powerful and all-good and all-knowing, is disproved, I think, by the existence of natural disasters. And the final argument, which again, echoing something that I think Kathleen said at the start, is why wouldn't you assume that the God is evil? If you are the type of person that believes in an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good God, and you say, well, the reason that we have free will is that God wants us to voluntarily do good. He doesn't want to force us to do good. He wants us to voluntarily do good. And in order to do that, he has to enable evil to exist so that we can choose through free will to do good instead of being forced to. But that's equally consistent. The evidence of the world is equally consistent using that argument with an evil God who wants us to do evil. But he wants us to do evil by free will rather than by forcing us to do evil. So he has to ensure the existence of good in order to enable us to voluntarily do evil instead of being forced to do evil. So whichever version of God you believe in, it's just a matter of personal choice. The evidence of the world is equally consistent with either. Or indeed, as George Carlin said, once said, maybe there's a God and he doesn't give a shit, or alternatively, what I believe, that there isn't a God. And so I'll just summarise by saying, does evil disprove the biblical God? No, it doesn't. But it does disprove the type of God that the type of people who used to believe in the biblical God have moved on to believing in, which is people who still believe that God is just, but because our sense of morality has evolved, the idea of a just God is now more consistent with the idea of an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God than it is with an all-powerful, ruthless God that looks out for your interests in a sort of military way. And I think beyond any reasonable doubt, that type of God is disproved by evil. And when you add into the equation the fact that there are many other arguments that disprove the existence of gods, we don't even need evil to disprove it, but it does add to the arguments. Thank you very much.
We now call on Dr. Portia Ryan to oppose the motion.
Sorry. Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here tonight. So this House believes the existence of evil disproves God. And evil is undoubtedly a problem in our world today. On Thursday, 22 people were killed in Beirut. On Friday, 129 were killed in Paris. And on Sunday, France bombed Syria. Evil is undoubtedly a force to be reckoned with. It is a real problem. But does the existence of evil disprove God? Does the existence of people who perform evil actions prove that the ultimate source and meaning of the universe cannot be unconditional compassion and love? I argue that this is not so. The central tenet on which I oppose the House's view is that the understanding of God that underpins this argument is based on a faulty conception of God. I argue as a theist, and so I assert, yes, God exists. The question of the existence of God is tightly connected with my next question, a question that people have been referring to earlier. What is God? Once a concept of the God underpinning my argument has been established, I shall address the question or the problem of evil. The key question here, I think, is what is meant by the word evil, and what precisely is the evil that disproves the existence of God? So firstly tonight I ask, what is God? And secondly, what is the evil we are talking about when we suggest that the existence of evil disproves God? It shall be shown that the proposition seeking to disprove the existence of God is in fact a false problem, a faulty line of argumentation. And so to begin, what is God? Thomas Aquinas reminds us that God does not belong in any creaturely category whatsoever. We speak of God because we want to speak of the source of all creaturely categories. We ask, why is there something rather than nothing? As Brian Davies puts it, God is odd. And as I put it regularly in classes, God is not he. This, I suggest, is where many philosophers, both atheists and theists, go wrong. I agree with D.Z. Phillips' argument that thinkers such as Mackey and Platina, that they do not appreciate, that people such as Mackey and Platina, you do not appreciate what Philip terms the grammar of God. They speak incorrectly of God. Richard Swinburne is another example of a thinker who I think uses incorrect speech about God. Swinburne describes God as a person without a body, a spirit that is eternal, free, that knows everything, is able to do everything, and is perfectly good. This God is a conscious creature, a moral agent, so constituted that God always does the morally good action. Swinburne's God is an exemplar of perfect moral goodness. For these thinkers, the statement, God is good, implies that God is morally good. All these notions of God are strongly anthropomorphic, and thus invalid. God is not a being among beings. God is not a moral agent. Moral evil is attributable to human beings and not to God. And this problem of anthropomorphism is not new. Matthew Arnold, writing in the 1870s, commented that people talk about God as if God were a magnified and non-natural man. He astutely comments that while Christianity teaches that God made man in his own image, man has repaid the compliment and made God outwardly and inwardly in the image of man. Arnold's point is decisive. For God is not one of a kind. God is not the best, most powerful, most moral of all that has been created. This is a key point. God is not one of a kind. When theists describe God as omnipotent, omniscient, and good, it is important to note that we do not know what these words mean when it comes to God. We do not know what they mean. God is radically incomprehensible. God appears in forms that hide God. We use crude imagery and rough words. As Herbert Mackay puts it, the words used to describe God are like badly fitting clothes. We grope in the dark when it comes to talk about God. So when we say God is good, we do not mean that God is the best behaved person in the room. This is where many of the philosophers of the problem of evil and the existence of God seem to get it wrong. God is not to be understood in the category of person, a being among beings. Talk of God and creatures is not univocal, but analogical. For God to be God is for God to be uncaused. For God to be good means that God is the source of the being of everything created, and that God is faithful to God's covenant with people. With Aquinas, the question of God's goodness is not that of a moral agent. God does not have obligations. God is not able to have virtues or vices. God has no moral question to answer. This is why someone like Aquinas never really discusses the problem of evil and God, as it was not a problem for Aquinas. My contention is that this issue receives so much attention today precisely and quite simply because we have got God wrong. So now to evil. I will focus on evil done, on morally wrong behaviour. An evil person, I suggest, is one lacking the virtues a human being should have, such as kindness, justice, and love. The obvious question here is, why does God not prevent their evil actions, as we've heard earlier? Could God not have stopped Hitler, or the people who bombed Paris, and those who bombed Beirut? These questions direct us to the heart of the problem, a mistaken account of what God is and of God's relationship to the universe. What God is unknown to us. God is the difference between there being anything at all and nothing at all. At the nub of the so-called problem of evil is the sense that the Almighty Creator could stand to our freedom only by way of exclusion of it. So that if moral evil is the product of our free wills, then God cannot be held responsible for it. In other words, God is left off the hook, because, as it were, the territory of freedom is God-free. Otherwise, it couldn't be freedom. So many proclaim. I argue the other way around. God makes all things out of nothing, but makes many things out of other things which God has made. One might say there is a democracy of natural causes, a democracy of making, as it were autonomous, created by God out of nothing, but created so as to operate according to relevant laws. The relationship between God and our freedom is thus mediated by natural causes. Our freedom is not a territory which is God-free. With Aquinas, I argue that our freedom is the place where God is most evidently visible. Our freedom is the place where God is most evidently visible. In other words, one cannot use Plato's free will defence to oppose the motion that the existence of evil disproves God. It is in our freedom that God is most causally present. God doesn't cause our evil actions, but God causes the very freedom without which our actions could not happen. God does not cause the evil of the action that God thus causes. This is not because God is good, not because God could, of course, cause an evil action, but being the good sort of person God is, God doesn't. God cannot cause evil. It is incoherent to think of God as causing evil. Following the thought of Aristotle, taken up by Aquinas, only a defective cause can cause a defective effect. Only a faulty agent can cause a failed action. So to return to the beginning. The motion that the existence of evil disproves God is to be refuted. The problem itself is a false problem. The answer to the question, what is God, is that yes, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and good. But we do not know what these words mean when it comes to God, because God is radically incomprehensible. The problem posed in the motion is, I claim, a false problem. We are the cause of evil. The problem is not with God, but with us. As Samuel Beckett said, as he looked over the ruins of Saint-Lô in 1944, we must rethink the human condition. Thank you very much.
I now call on Dr. Ian Lees to propose the motion.
Hello. If you're expecting a sophisticated, nuanced presentation from a professional philosopher, then I apologise in advance. I'd like to speak for the proposition, but I think I'm probably going to do a little more than restate or reiterate some kind of well-established, venerable claims, and I'll probably converge to some extent with points made on both sides, strangely enough. First, I'm going to assume, and this is obviously controversial, that the God referred to in the proposition is the standard Judeo-Christian deity, that this is the loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God.
This is important for what I want to say. So I'm not speaking about a limited or finite deity like the God of the personalists. That's, of course, open to debate whether that's a suitable definition of God, but that's what I'm working with. So with this established, or at least asserted, well, let's consider the kind of standard charge as we've already had it laid out, going back at least to Epicurus. The world is full of all sorts of pain, suffering, and evil. God is supposed to be all-powerful and all-loving. So either God allows such evil to continue existing, which would seem to undermine claims for his or her goodness, or else God wants to stop such suffering but can't, which would seem to undermine claims for his or her power. This is kind of philosophy 101, I appreciate, but it's still maybe an important fundamental to reiterate. A lot of the debate around this issue can be gathered under the general heading of consistency, or the consistency problem, whether we're talking about the evils that humans are directly responsible for, or whether we're talking about the suffering that seems to emerge directly from nature itself. How on earth can all of the horror and pain that seem to characterize so much of life be consistent with the putative existence of an all-loving, all-powerful deity? This is obviously a huge issue for the theist, and such an important intellectual objection to theism. As it happens, I don't think that the theistic responses to the question are entirely incoherent, far from it. For example, and maybe this is still philosophy 101, one could say that when it comes to moral evil, so-called, the horrible things that humans do day in, day out, we wouldn't be properly human, whatever that might be, if we were morally perfect automata that didn't have the freedom to love or not love God, to follow or not follow God's ways, and so on. And in terms of natural evil, one could say that those who raise this as an accusation seem to want God regularly to intervene in the workings of nature to an absurd extent. The law of gravity, for example, would have to be suspended every time someone slipped or fell. Any sort of consistent or patterned existence would become impossible. Other approaches might be to deny the very existence of evil, or to suggest that the notion is an index of our ignorance. From a God's eye perspective, we'd see that all's well with the cosmos, that this is the best of all possible worlds, that this world is merely a porch onto something bigger and better, and so on. As I say, I'm not dismissing everything that the theist claims. I think the existence of evil is a massive problem for the theist, but I'm not sure that talk about the so-called consistency problem provides a total refutation of the theist's position. It doesn't seem utterly impossible to me that there might be an all-loving, all-powerful deity existing simultaneously with evil as we experience it. Seems unlikely, but it's not impossible. So instead, in looking to my countryman David Hume, who is such a foundational source for the entire debate, maybe the entire fallacy, Fanshed, let me turn to another aspect of this conundrum, the inference problem. Again, this is still fairly basic. Maybe it's philosophy 201, I don't know. But I think it's worth articulating in the current context. Roughly speaking, the inference problem is concerned, as the name suggests, with what we infer from our experience. So it's operating at the level of what matters to us in terms of our day-to-day lives, rather than asking slightly more abstract questions like, how can God let this happen, and so on. It begins from us, not God. What does human life, or so much human life, consist of? Well, in this respect, I can do a little better, I think, than quote the very eloquent Hume himself. The whole earth, he says, is cussed and polluted. A perpetual war is kindled amongst all living creatures. Necessity, hunger, and want stimulate the strong and courageous. Fear, anxiety, and terror agitate the weak and infirm. The first entrance into life gives anguish to the newborn infant and to its wretched parent. Weakness, impotence, distress attend each stage of that life, and it is at last finished in agony and horror. He continues, were a stranger to drop into this world, I would show him as a specimen of its ills a hospital full of diseases, a prison crowded with malefactors, a field of battle strewed with carcasses, a fleet foundering on the ocean, a nation languishing under tyranny, famine, or pestilence. You can take the boy out of the Calvinist kirk, but doing this other way around is problematic maybe. Anyway, in a nutshell, so much of human life, it seems, is utterly miserable, a grotesque pantomime of unmitigated suffering, occasionally punctuated by temporary narcotic, aesthetic, or erotic escape. Given then that the world is supposed to be evidence of a deity at work in the cosmos, what, accordingly, might we infer, going back to this word again, about the supposed divine author of all the stuff that we have to put up with? Well, nothing very flattering, it would seem. We can hardly assume that God wills our happiness because we're so rarely happy, on the contrary. And we can hardly think of God as good or benevolent. How could we, given that we've got to put up with so much in a world that is, as Hume puts it, full of vice and misery and disorder? Or, if you want to put it slightly differently, imagine a being with the same sort of intelligence and characteristics as us humans, but who's never experienced life on Earth before. We tell this alien that the world is a product of a very good, wise, powerful being. What on earth would her reaction be as she surveyed the pain and suffering we have to contend with? Utter incredulity. She could hardly accept this is the work of a good thing, of a good creature. Alternatively, in case you're dubious about positing some alien observer, as a thought experiment, try to imagine what a world created by a good and providential designer might look like. Then compare this blueprint that you might have been able to establish with the actuality of this world. How do the two shape up? Would the ideal contain floods and earthquakes that devastate vast areas of land, babies washed up on beaches, genocide, a solar system that will eventually head towards ultimate implosion and be replaced by black nothingness? I think not. So there seems to be a pretty considerable gap between what one might imagine an all-loving good deity would establish and what we're actually faced with. So there's all of this showdown that the problem of consistency and, maybe more importantly, the problem of inference, there's all of this show that there's no such thing as a deity. Well, not necessarily. But if there is some sort of cause or ultimate causal principle behind all that is, what can we say about it? We can't say it's wholly evil, Hume concedes, and maybe in slight disagreement with you, Michael, I don't know. There is order and regularity. There's occasional pleasure and enjoyment to be had in this world. But we can't say it's wholly good either, for all the reasons that I've already rehearsed. The best description we have, Hume suggests, is that any such causal factor doesn't really care. The most we're entitled to infer from our own experience, it seems, that if there is some sort of causal agent behind the cosmic curtain, as it were, it's wholly indifferent. It doesn't care about us. It's, as I say, there's a certain convergence with what I'm saying here in earlier speakers, but I'm maybe coming at this from a different angle. This isn't a God of goodness and plenitude and love. In short, evil might not rule out the possibility of a divinity, but looked at in terms of this inference principle, evil fatally undermines belief in a standard Judeo-Christian God of love and goodness, which is why I urge you to support the motion. Thank you.
I now call on Grace Conway to oppose the motion.
Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of my time, energy, and resources have gone into this debate, and since its early conception back in April, I've had many hours alone to think it through. And due to that, the direction of where I wanted it to go has actually changed a lot. Many people have tried to justify evil to an eschatological end in their theodicy, and initially I saw this as an opportunity to reference Aquinas and Luther and Moltmann and cross-reference with them with Dostoevsky and Camus, and read out quotes from Elie Wiesel's Little Me, which something which every theology student has to do at some point during an essay. And in summary, my desire here was to use the debate as a platform for exploring these brilliant minds of the past. But then I realized that I spend most of my time exploring these brilliant minds of the past. And I'm like, these kind of oaken rooter theories of classical thinkers, and many of which are moving from the realm of, idea to law code for students and professors alike. And I'll continue to toil away with them for the foreseeable future, but I can't speak here for Luther or Moltmann. I can only speak for myself. So I might as well start developing my own shaky theodicy. Because like theology is not done from a neutral place, and we cannot, and if the hypothetical God we are discussing is it has to be a personal God, then nobody can tell me how to interpret why this God would allow such things as genocide, like the unmasked slaughtering of innocent people, or cancer, a disease where tumours can immediately infest you like mushrooms and kill you slowly. And the problem here is that theories about God fall short of these experiences, and they do not reach the reality. And that is why those opposing the motion have to concede to a lot of the, but what about the insert awful thing here arguments at the prop. Like, whatever hope God has for trying to rationalise this, neither me nor anyone in this room who has seen the photos, read the books, or felt the horror like unfold ever could. But for me, the problem with evil is not solved by using this trope of God as a negligent paterfamilias who has deserted us as a means to scapegoat human suffering. Blaming God for the world's suffering is futile because God is such a vague and varied term. The only uniting factor about God is that we consistently discuss it in human terms, used that we have created to describe the sort of God we believe in. And we can make this God negligent or eschatological or whatever we want or need him to be to sleep at night. We can fit the sort of God into any sort of size box that confronts us, and we can even try to stretch it to encompass a Holocaust-shaped box and then try to blame him for that. But this sort of God is very easy to disprove when measured against the idea of all physical and moral evil, as would any all-encompassing broad hypothesis be. It's stretched, it's strained, it's vague. But the problem is then I don't know any people of any faith who believe in that sort of black and white good versus evil God. Like, one of the buzzwords and my favourite word used in the contemporary study of religion is dialectic. And a dialectic God is not an extremist binary God, he's a both and God. And that's my next point. So, in a traditional sense, he is the God of both life and death, both joy and suffering, both pain and redemption, both authority over humanity and voluntary fellow sufferer. But that all sounds very Christianized and homogenous. On a more relatable level, this is a God of having your head stuck down the toilet because you drank too much gin, and also the God of being 21 years old and sharing a spice bag with your friends on the side of a road. And these are the reasons we continue to go out and we continue to move forward in full knowledge that there will be both good and bad times, which are all part of the experience of life, both the best and worst experience you will ever have. Some of us here believing that it's the only experience we will ever have. And that leads me on to my next point. So, if the experience of life is so essentially dialectic, why do we continue to define things in the binary of good versus evil, which stands in direct opposition to our reality? And where do these definitions of good and evil come from? As long as we've been civilized, the idea of evil is something which has influenced our basic archetypal mythologies, our consciousness, as has been formative in nearly all religions in one form or another, be it chaos, demons, sin, the devil, whatever have you. Ideas about evil are inherent and ingrained in our are as inherent and ingrained in our very being as ideas about God, and just as varied and vague. It's completely subjective, and as much as we have a personal relationship with God, we also have a personal relationship with evil. I have experienced a lot of extremely evil things, and I've done a lot of things that some of you might consider to be evil, and I assume, given the room that's in it, that we all have. Where then do we draw the line? Do we draw it at the Holocaust, rape, or murder? Do we draw it at a point where we can no longer identify a human being as being responsible for these atrocities? And is that when we attribute it to God? We stick all of these unavoidable horrors of our reality into a hypothetical category under the umbrella heading of the problem of evil, and chuck it into a vacuum where it can coexist or not exist with our ideas about God. As a hypothesis, God is dialectically we are both able to prove and to disprove God based on any sort of evidence that we can provide. We cannot affirm the existence of God, but neither can we affirm the existence of something as subjective as evil that we can also only ever create ideas about in human terms. The only thing that can be proved by either evil or God is that humanity likes to put names on things that it cannot understand. There is no authority on the existence of evil or the existence of God that can verify or nullify this argument. If the proper considering ideas about God, which they claim to be disproved as an authority on evil, then there is no argument. There is no higher power to them than evil, and that's quite sad, because it doesn't take into account that if they too believe in evil, that they must also believe in good, and to some degree to provide a contrast. And I think many people's belief in God rests essentially on the reverse of that idea, that God is that force of good in the universe that allows evil to provide contrast.
But whether you believe in God or not is not what we are arguing here. This debate is about whether or not evil disproves God. In this case, faith is irrelevant. We are most welcome to take the atheistic position, but if we do so, we should do so for ourselves because it is the conclusion we have come to by our own exploration, and not because we feel forced to by an idea of evil which is inseparable from our reality. Both evil and God are conceptual ideologies, both are freely subjective, and neither could be confirmed or disproved by us or anything in our reality, and for this reason, I beg you to oppose.
I think they want me to take them, but I'm going to be like a rebel and say, no, I'll waive the rights. So, when I was 10 years old, a series of earthquakes, you might remember this, led to a tsunami striking several countries across the Indian Ocean. It was the day after Christmas, and over 30,000 people died. That is the day that I personally stopped believing in God. My name is Dermot Davern, and I'm here to propose belief that the existence of evil disproves God, and I'm here to do that with a passion. I'll get on to a few points of rebuttal. Unfortunately, I'm left in a very envious position that there's not a lot of engagement because we're all disagreeing on what God is, and that leads us to basically go, well, their definition is wrong and our definition is right, and so I'm just going to sit in my chair and you're wrong, I'm right. Obviously, that's very tough for a whip to now. It's very hard for me to engage with this, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. Basically, I want to say that, first of all, far be it from me to define what we're proposing as a house. I mean, that's obviously not my right, except it is. But basically, it's unfair to take the definition of God as being any God you could think of or any God you want. Because how can we found a debate on those terms? My definition of God is now suddenly Loki from Marvel. And of course he's evil. That just doesn't work. We obviously need to go with the definition of God that I feel most people probably hold, which is the benevolent, omnipresent person who just, wants everything to work out for us. Almost like the Fonz in, Happy Days. It's Happy Days he was in, right? Not right now, thank you very much, Meg. Thank you. So basically, in order for the opposition to win, they have to, without a shadow of a doubt, prove to you that every act of evil has a purpose or the possibility of good in God's infinite plan. Because I'm sorry, I simply do not accept their definition of God. I can't, because if I were to do that, we could be here all day arguing about, well, is my God technically the monkey that sits there and hits the start button on the universe and then just sits back and eats bananas all day? I mean, that doesn't work. That really doesn't work. So basically, they have to prove to you that for every Joseph Fritzl, every Mengele, or every ISIS terrorist, that they're all part of God's omnipotent plan. Ladies and gentlemen, the God we are pursuing is omniscient and is omnipotent. That's nobody on our side has ever said anything to the otherwise, apart from, of course, our doctor friend here. I'm a little bit hot. I'm a little bit under the weather. Basically, to claim that there's a world in which unconceivable acts of terrorism, violence, and genocide is the best possible world an omnipotent God, could create, that's essentially a cop-out. And I don't think we can really, let that hold any weight. So basically, just to quickly recap what my side went on to say, because unfortunately, we all had the same point. And 1 second, Jordan, sorry very much. So we started with Colin, who gave us a very lovely and succinct model in which we're looking at the rational God who we believe him to be omnipotent, and therefore we believe that his rational view is to make the best universe he can, and that apparently this universe where horrible, unconscionable acts happen is the best he could do, which obviously is a bit of a paradox. I mean, how can he be omnipotent and this is the best he can do? That's a little bit silly. Then we had Kira, who went on to reaffirm this motion despite what the proposition said. And actually, go on, Mark.
our perceptions of evil are totally and utterly subjective. Someone from biblical times would view this world as really evil because women are allowed to speak publicly. Surely, like, even if we had this perfect world, we would still find something else to view as, like, the worst evil ever.
I would argue that point, because I would say that there are some acts of evil that are so unconscionable, so just humane and barbaric, that everybody here could call them evil. One moment. Like, for example, we all know about Joseph Fritzl, who held one of his daughters in basically underground for 15 years, in which she was physically, sexually, and mentally abused. Nobody here, not even Joseph Fritzl himself, when commenting on it, can ever claim that it's anything else than an unconscionable act of evil. So yes, while there are some acts of evil that are in the grey area that some people would agree on, for example, a lot of the Catholic Church thinks that gay marriage is evil and people being homosexual is evil. Granted, there's a lot of things, well, I wouldn't even say that's in the grey area, but there's a lot of people that would find that, different versions of evil, interact and they don't quite agree on them. However, there are some things we can definitely point to and definitely go, yes, that's morally wrong. Yes, sorry, Campbell.
But God gave humans the act of free choice, as shown by them eating the apple. How can you blame these actions of humans on the choices of God when God himself did not choose the actions that these evil people did?
So basically, that goes back to a point one of the people on my set had already said. Basically, that God can limit our free will in a way that he has already limited our free will in the sense that we cannot literally do anything we want. God created, if God is a creator, if God is a creator, he essentially already placed restrictions on us in the natural world. Why not go a little bit step farther and to give us a free will, but limit that free will to actions that are not inherently evil and barbaric? Just to go on quickly, So then we have the whole argument, didn't even start after that, no. So basically, then we have the idea that God is, okay, so just to humor the opposite side, because otherwise we won't have any engagement whatsoever, taking their definition of God as something that, is God is the guy who starts things and often he's just a neutral observer. He sits back, he's like the scientist, he sets the experiment in motion and then he backs off, all right? Well, in that case, can we not refer to God as a fundamental force? And in that case, is gravity not a God and Newton his prophet? No, thank you. I think I've taken too many at this point, maybe towards the end a little bit. I am light on material, but I'm not that light. So in that sense, you're looking at the pantheistic God that, say, Einstein or Spinoza. I thought I was way behind time. Okay, sorry about that. I was going to take another one. But basically, then we're looking at the pantheistic God as exposed by Spinoza. That's a nice little alliteration there. And Einstein, in which case the God is in the laws. In which case, I would have to argue that that's no God at all. And that's the main reason, you can't, it's protected time. That's the main reason why we keep coming back to the fact that we need to agree on a definition of God for this debate to really go anywhere. And as the House that proposes it, and also as a definition of God that most people find true, most people go to Mass, or their mosque, or their synagogue, that is true. You can't quite argue that. That most of them would hold to believe that this is their version of God, the omnibenevolent, omnipresent God who is keeping us and just basically watching over us like the big brother. So really, this is the main problem that we're coming to here. And if we want to continue this debate in any kind of successful manner, we've got to agree on something, or at least you've got to engage us on those grounds. That's all I wish to say for now. I beg you to propose.
I waive my rights. Members of the College Historical Society, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing me to speak here tonight. What I want to do in this speech is a couple of things. I'm going to look at what the sort of logical fallacy that exists with proposing this motion. I'm going to look at free will. I'm going to look at evil. I'm going to just first talk about this sort of misconception of what is God, this sort of definitional thing that has plagued the debate throughout the table. Okay, so we think fine, it's not inconceivable that God could be evil. As Ollie gives you in a POI, it is could be a guy playing Sims who, as Ollie said to me earlier, accidentally spills a glass of water on his computer and causes a hurricane. We don't think that's but we'll take it at their definition. We'll take it at the definition of God, as we most know, is best in the 21st century. This like creator. So we say there's a couple of like things like with their misconceptions. They've told us like either he can't, like they said he has to be able to intervene, and like the problem with it, their assertion is that they've said God, is all-knowing, all-powerful, therefore he would definitely intervene, and we don't necessarily think that's true. That's what I'm going to go on to in this speech. Okay, so firstly, like on their sort of like the logical fallacy. So whether like you believe in God or not, you cannot just like ask yourself, if you don't believe in God, why is it that evil is that reason? Surely like a more logical way of looking at that is whether you believe, the universe was created by science or not. Whether you believe that like it is possible for there to be a creator. They've told us we have to defend heaven. I say we don't, to be honest. Like heaven doesn't necessarily have to exist for God to exist. Maybe this is the one life. Like the idea of having two lives is a bit weird, to be brutally honest. Also, if we have one life, we're more likely to live it best. I like to try and live my life by the YOLO mentality. I would encourage you all to do the same. Okay, so we think that like a better way to look at whether God exists is to ask these sort of questions. We think evil can conceivably exist, as our site has shown you, as I will continue showing you, with God existing. Okay, so like the first thing is this idea of free will. So Dermot asks in a POI like why ISIS is like part of God's plan. Here's a reason why it might be. Okay, every choice you as a human being make, every single action you do, everything you do, like from choosing your food, from choosing like what you think, from choosing who you love, like all of these are free will. Every right that you have, your right to life, your right to choose, your right to assemble, comes from this idea that humans are free, that humans should be able to do what they want. That's like at the crux of everything that we as debaters do. We talk about freedom, we talk about rights, we talk about how to maximize a person's satisfaction. That is what like this sort of fundamental free will comes from. The fundamental free will gives us this. It gives us this like ability to have an enjoyable life. But with that free will comes the fact that sometimes we make choices that aren't good. I could Dermot gives you this sort of bizarre idea that free will is like, if we don't have full free will because we can't defy physical things, because we can't jump over buildings. We say that like science can exist at the same time as free will existing, and like I don't make a choice like whether I want to be on senior rowers or not. Like, I make a choice, to go upstairs and drink wine and eat bread after this debate. But I don't, if I stop doing that, I can't just make a choice, to be strong enough to be on the first team. That's not how physics works. Then we have this, when we make these choices, sometimes we know we do something that isn't the best idea. Sometimes we know we make a mistake. Sometimes we know we do something that, isn't the best thing. Other times we don't. For the most part, though, while we make it with our tiny little actions, such as I could have got the salad, but I went for the steak instead, or something like that. We think that's a minor thing. But for those sort of major decisions, for those things that guide our lives, for deciding what we do as a morally right thing a lot of the time, for deciding sort of big choices. We act because we believe we are acting good. I'll take you in a second. We act because we believe we are acting rationally. We are acting with the best intentions. These actually go on.
Well, I mean, isn't this based on the idea that free will exists? I mean, if we believe that the entire world is predetermined, like some Christians do, I mean, what would you hope this would establish?
I don't believe the entire world is predetermined. I think free will exists. I don't think it's I think when you have a God that creates the world, that or they created humans with that free will. So I think that's how it exists. Okay, so often people act because they believe they're making the right choice, because they believe they're doing what is right. The people we heard about earlier in this debate who believed in stoning women for not being virgins on their wedding night. We know that is evil. We perceive that as evil. They didn't. They genuinely believed that was right, that they were honoring God. That's that sort of perception of evil, which was something that we told. Evil is in the eyes of the beholder, effectively. So we can almost argue there evil doesn't exist. That's not an argument I want to take. There is this perception of evil that does exist in a debate, and that does exist in reality. And with this perception, we need to realize that we're allowed this to happen. That sort of subjectivity comes, and that God can allow this because because they realize that free will is something that is more important. And we think that on the balance, free will is something that we deem as really important, because without it, life would kind of suck. Okay, so secondly, evil, why it might be good. The reason I'm arguing this is two things. Firstly, I'm in this debate. Secondly, I'm a capitalist. Okay. So like, we've already told you, when it comes to things like earthquakes, that is, like, from that sort of utilitarian balance, that allows for, crops to grow. We think that, like, those sort of natural evils may have a cause. We think it's conceivable to say that maybe they are allowed to happen, either because A, God cannot intervene because they simply created the Big Bang, or B, because they don't want to, because maybe they want to test humans, maybe they want to, like, see if humans act better. I don't know. Believe it or not, I'm not God. I can't make that kind of call. I'm just giving a potential hypothesis. Okay, we also think that, like, evil is what allows enjoyment of life. Like, that sort of human perception of heaven. Okay, that is when we perceive it as, like, this perfect thing, two things happen. Either it's not perfect, in which case we create brand new horrible evils, like the way that our society created brand new horrible evils compared to a society from, several centuries back, that there are different perceptions of evil. Or we don't, in which case we have this world of, like, true perfection, which would probably be hell to live in, because there would be nothing to incentivize you. It would be like going to an IV and breaking and winning every single time. You'd probably give up debating eventually, because there's no challenge left, there's no zest left, there's, like, literally nothing to strive for in life. That sort of life is a good thing. It's important because there's an obstacle, because we take that next step, because there is something we need to do, something more. There's something driving us. It is for these reasons we beg you to oppose.
Okay, thank you very much. I will now put the question to the House. On the motion, this House believes that the existence of evil disproves God. All those in favour, say aye.
Aye.
All those against?
Nay.
I think there's more nays. So, I'm just going to say a few words. I'm not going to keep you too long because so much has been said already. I must say I really enjoyed the debate. I thought it was very well conducted. I also want to commend the audience, who were exceptionally well behaved, much better than in my day when I was debating. So I think that everybody listened to everybody else. There was a lot of common ground. I mean, there was a lot of clustering of the arguments around, first of all, both definitional questions, what is evil and what is God? And then, the question which was some degree of compatibility there is between the notion of extant evil in the world and the existence of God. But I'd just like to make some comments on some of the things I heard. About the definition of God, it's clearly the case that in one sense you can say that the concept of God is a human invention. Religions are certainly human practices. They've evolved differently in different cultures. The conceptions of God have evolved differently. But that isn't to say that there isn't something that this concept is pointing to, even though we may not be getting it right. There is definitely a history, evolving history to the conception of God. And I would say it's not the conception that most people arrive at, as the one we've heard, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, eternal, usually, being who is benevolent and is also the creator of all things. That God is mostly what you'll find all cultures merging towards when they start thinking about it. So even in Indian Hindu religions or in Buddhist religions, there's a recognition that whatever God is beyond our current conceptions, beyond our current images. In fact, there's a lot of discussion about this, that really the first failure of all religions is, if you like, idolatry, putting up some kind of an idol instead of a genuine conception of God. So the real task of all religions, I suppose, is to find an appropriate conception of God. And there, I think Forcha says something about that in saying that God is incomprehensible. And others mentioned that we can only think of God in some sort of analogical terms. So I think I would agree with that. I do think that one conception of the divine which has not really been discussed here at all is what we might call the transcendence of the divine. The idea that whatever God is, it's beyond everything that we can think about. That God is, if you like, better approached by some kind of notion of absence or distance or negation or nothingness, rather than by the idea that we can fit God into some kind of a box. And I think that notion of a transcendent nothingness or transcendent other to whatever we know and experience and whatever can be found in the created order, I think that's a very compelling and powerful conception of the divine. A divine that is just other than everything else. Because everything is, if you take the kind of orthodox theist view that everything that is created by God, God then has to be beyond everything that is, other than what is. So, and that has led people to say that God is not, but not that God doesn't, if you like, exist at all, but that God doesn't exist in any of the senses in which we say things exist. So that leaves it an open question whether there is a sort of other of God. There's a certainly the so that's on the definition of God. That's what comment I'd like to make on the definition of first cause. I mean, this problem was recognized as early as Aristotle and others. That some people mentioned the problem of the infinite regress. It was, I think, famously Bertrand Russell who was talking to someone about Hindu thought or some religious thought anyway, and where they said, what is the universe? The universe is, is sustained because it is resting on the back of an elephant, and then what's the elephant standing on? And the person says it's standing on a giant tortoise, and the question was, what's the tortoise standing on? And the answer was, it's tortoises all the way down. And I think that's the problem of the infinite regress, that everybody ends up sort of saying, well, there has to be something causing whatever it is that we are starting with, whether it's the Big Bang or the ultimate new primacy or whatever it was that was said here that started it all. You were always able to ask, and what caused that? So I do think that our minds, our natural human questioning, always wants to push the boundaries and always wants to ask what's behind. And I think from Aristotle onwards there was a recognition that whatever the ultimate cause is, it can't just be a physical thing like everything else. I forget who it was. It was one of the Russian astronauts who came back. I think it was the first astronaut who circumnavigated the Earth and came back and said, and I didn't see God. Because the assumption, I mean, if you have any kind of an assumption that God is some element in the existing universe, then you're not thinking about God in the transcendent sense. So, that's what so I think that whatever kind of a first God is, it can't be something in the sense of what is described as the monkey pressing a button and eating bananas or whatever. There can't be any sort of a mechanical first call. Okay, on evil, the very first speaker, Colin, mentioned this, that evil is a privation. That is, that it's the absence of something, but it isn't itself a something. Now that's very hard to understand, and I've tried to explain it over the years, and I finally worked out an analogy that I'll share with you and see if you get it. Think of any evening that you're sitting in your library deciding what to do, and you have a choice, you have an assignment due the next day, but it's either that or, as they say on Yik Yak, Netflix and chill. So which do you do? Well, writing the essay is a good thing to do. And get you pass the examination, then get you further along in your career. It's a good in itself. You'll understand more about the topic. It's definitely a good thing. And who could argue that Netflix and chilling isn't a good thing? If it's taken in the full sense of the word. I understand you do. I have to be explaining myself. then if you like, you can think of one as being sort of taller than the other, one having more good than the other, having the, Netflix and chill has this much goodness, the other one has that much goodness, and the difference, which is nothing at all, is the evil. Right? So, I think when you see it that way, you don't then think of evil as some dark matter, that falls around in the back of the universe somewhere, but think of it as an absence of doing the good thing. So that's what I think the traditional argument, as you find in St. Augustine and others, Aquinas, all the people who mentioned, who want to talk about evil as sort of not being real in some sense. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to talk about another conception, which is whether God knows evil. This was always a debate among theologians because because all the kinds of things that were said, if God knows that evil is going to happen, why doesn't he stop it? He didn't stop it. And a lot of philosophers and theologians have taken the view that God, strictly speaking, doesn't know evil. And the point is, you would say, but God is omniscient, so surely that's contradicting God's omniscience, because now you've got some area that God doesn't know. Well, again, a bit like this business about evil, there's a way of thinking about that which can make it less of a contradiction. And again, the sort of way that I have of thinking about this is, think of two people. This is adapting an example from David Hume. The person who sees the purse of money lying on the ground in the train station, and you think, my God, that's a lot of money. And then you have this moral debate, will I keep it or will I give it back to the owner? That person, if you like, can see the moral evil involved in keeping it rather than giving it back to the owner. But, shall we call it the saint, the very good person, is someone for whom it would never occur to them to keep. They just pick it up and say, whose is this? Right? So that person, it's not that they know less than the other person, it's just they wouldn't even conceive of anything evil. And in that sense, then, the argument is that you can have an omniscient God of this kind, who's so benevolent, that evil would never even occur to him. And that way you can allow for a compatibility between omniscience and the existence of evil. So I could go on, but I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Particular thanks to Metaphys, who collaborated with us on this event. Also, just a couple of announcements. Next week's debate, which will be here in half 7, is the Student Economic Review debate, which is Trinity versus Cambridge. So, you can come support Trinity. And this house believes a Brexit will be positive for the EU, so certainly come along to that. There will be a great reception afterwards. Also, we've had a bit of a location change for our reception. Our reception is actually next door here in the Phil conversation room, as opposed to ours upstairs. So please come and join us. That's it.
I call this house adjourned.
And Meg, the pages. Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Semantics got us again. I realised that's all was it? That's mine as well.
I guess that's a problem. You forget that it's not what you did. So you can see how they get something. If they get absorbed in it, to the extent that they actually think that they're talking about things that are actually real. Yeah, and then doing as well is not doing your effort in jail or genocide.
Couldn't quite fit that into the whole equation.